Good evening, students. Today we will be discussing the American Civil War, lecture part 2. Again, please use Cornell Notes. Use the slide headings to create your guiding questions for your notes. Today we will be focusing on the following things. First off, generals, who is in charge and how successful they are. Battles, who won, who lost, what tactics were used, and what the significance of the battle is. And then lastly, strategy, what was the strategy employed by each side, and how is the strategy being deployed. Thank you very much, and remember at the end, please summarize your notes. This portion of the Civil War will focus mainly on the Western Theater, that is the theater that is up and down the Mississippi River, with a brief mention of the Battle of Antietam that happened in Maryland, which was the second furthest northern battle of the war. Thank you, and please enjoy. Now, Abraham Lincoln had a significant tactical disadvantage to the Southerners, and that was he lacked men who were capable of fighting. The first general that he employed, who created the Anaconda Plan, was old General Winfield Scott. And you may remember him from the Trail of Tears and then from the Mexican-American War. Well, by 1860, Scott was in his 70s and called himself too old and too fat to fight. He could barely ride a horse anymore, and so therefore he was not fit to serve in the field. Scott would be replaced by a quick succession of generals, including Irvin McDowell, who lost the Battle of Bull Run, George McClellan, who would have the longest tenure as the commander of the Army of the Potomac, but would lose many battles and only be able to pull a draw in a few. He would be replaced by Ambrose Burnside, who would also be considered a loser, and he would be replaced by Joseph Hooker, who would also be considered a loser. The only early winner in the group that was manning the Army of the Potomac would be George Meade, who won a very decisive and very important victory at Gettysburg, but failed to destroy the Southern Army, so he would be replaced. The most successful Union general would be the general who was fighting in the western portion of the country, and that was Ulysses S. Grant. He was given command over the western armies, and he proved to be victorious, although his victories oftentimes cost thousands of lives. We will discuss more about him later. Where Northern leadership was seen as a distinct weakness, the Confederate generals, on the other hand, were superb tacticians, starting with Robert E. Lee, the man who was slated to lead Union forces until his native state of Virginia seceded from the country, and he went along with his birthplace. Lee's right-hand man was Thomas Stonewall Jackson of West Virginia. He was an extremely aggressive and gifted tactician who attacked the United States Army with great vigor and attentiveness. Lee also had help from James Longstreet, who was also considered one of the best tacticians of the entire war, and his cavalry was headed by none other than Jeb Stuart, a man who is known for his daring and dashing in battle, and often rode with a flower in his lapel. To round out his forces was Nathan Bedford Forrest, a cavalry officer who moved all the way up from private to general during the war, the only person in the entire war to do this. Forrest paid for many of his supplies by himself, as he was a wealthy western Tennessee plantation owner. Now, Forrest was known for his brutality, especially towards freed slaves or contraband. Forrest, a large slave owner himself, would go on to found the Ku Klux Klan after the war. As we are focusing on the Western Theater, we will be focusing on the battles that happened in and around the Mississippi River. The idea of the Anaconda Plan was to take control over the Mississippi River, essentially severing the Confederacy in two and depriving them of their largest trade route in their country. Union forces would use gunboats to sweep down the Ohio River into the Mississippi and essentially conquer all of the tributaries leading into the Mississippi and hold the river itself, thus isolating Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy, and also taking out their trading routes. The Western Theater focused on capturing the Mississippi River. This would be achieved in two ways: having gunboats come down the Ohio and meet up with the Mississippi in Missouri, and having gunboats go up the Missouri from New Orleans. This would require New Orleans to be the first city captured, which it was by Admiral Farragut. And this would require for Tennessee to be seized first, which it eventually was by Ulysses S. Grant, Tennessee being the most friendly state to the Union in the South. The four most important battles in the West were Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chickamauga, and Atlanta. All of these, with the exception of Chickamauga, would be won by the Union. Chickamauga was the only one won by the Confederacy, and this consisted of the northern portion of Georgia, southern portion of Tennessee, right on the border. But even if it was a Confederate victory, it would still lead to the Union pushing forward into Atlanta and eventually taking Atlanta and moving all the way into Georgia on the Atlantic coast. Today we'll be discussing the taking of the Mississippi River, which included the victories at Shiloh and Vicksburg. The Battle of Shiloh was led by Ulysses S. Grant for the North and Albert Johnston for the South. Grant's main objective was to take back western Tennessee, thus firmly bringing Tennessee back into the Union. Grant had proven himself a very capable leader, using frontal assaults and gunboats to help him attack the far outnumbered Confederate forces. He would use the overwhelming might of his Union forces to crush Confederate forces to death. The Battle of Shiloh would happen on April 6, 1862, with Grant pushing down the Tennessee River after victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson along the Kentucky-Tennessee border. In an attempt to take the advantage, the Confederate General Albert Johnston would attack Union forces while they waited for resupplies near a small Methodist church called Shiloh. Shiloh, ironically, means peace. Initially caught off guard, Grant and his right-hand man, William Tecumseh Sherman, fought back extremely viciously and extremely hard. The battle would rage all day with no clear victor until the next day at dawn, when instead of retreating, Grant would lead a decisive charge against the Confederate forces, killing Johnson, and essentially crushing the Confederate forces. In the end, the Union would suffer 13,000 casualties, where the Confederacy would suffer only 11,400 casualties. However, the Union would claim firm control over western Tennessee with this victory and bring the state of Tennessee back into the fold. After his victory at Shiloh, Grant would continue to move west and south down the Mississippi River, battling through Mississippi until he reached Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg held a very important strategic position on the Mississippi River, occupying a bluff over the river, which allowed for the Confederate forces to fire down upon the river and any Union gunboats that would be patrolling. This city had to fall in order for the river to become part of Union territory. The position of the city made it very difficult to take. It was situated on top of a bluff overlooking a river with cliffs on the either side. This meant, in order to take it, you would have to take a full frontal assault up a hill towards a defensive position. This, in a lot of terms, was a suicide mission. Grant would settle on the strategy of using gunboats to attack the river's fortification, or the city's fortifications from the river, and a frontal assault directly up the hill, using his superior numbers to batter the Confederate defenses. After a while, however, there was about 4,000, almost 5,000 deaths from the initial assaults on Vicksburg. With the initial assaults proving futile, Grant decided that the best approach afterwards would be, in fact, a siege, meaning that he and his men and his boats would sit down and just relax for roughly 2 months until they starved the Confederates out. After 2 months, with the Confederates eating rats, horses, pigs, cats, dogs, and anything else that they could find in Vicksburg, eventually they decided to give up. And on July 4th, 1863, 29,495 Confederates surrendered the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, thus giving the entire Mississippi River over to the Union. This also encouraged President Lincoln to give Grant command of the entire Union Army. Many people in Congress were opposed to this because they saw Grant as a butcher with so many casualties in every one of his battles. However, Lincoln, upset with the lack of movement in the Eastern Theater, decided, well, you know what? Grant can actually fight, therefore he must be put in charge. Now, this also is oftentimes called the Trans-Mississippi Campaign, essentially crisscrossing the Mississippi, fighting soldiers in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and even into Texas. Also, all the way west into New Mexico, being the furthest western battle. Now, oftentimes with the Trans-Mississippi River, there was a lot of guerrilla fighting and tactics, especially in Missouri. These were led by very famous outlaws by the name of Frank, Jesse James, and Cole Younger. Missouri would in fact have, even though they were generally small skirmishes, the third most battles of any state during the war. Other western states, including New Mexico, would see action, New Mexico being the furthest west of any major battle during the war. There was an attempt to seize upper Louisiana in something called the Red River Campaign, which was generally seen as a failure, and Texas would stay part of Confederate stronghold throughout the war, even though it was cut in half after the fall of Vicksburg. This brings us to Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee was seen as the most capable military commander in the entire United States prior to the war, especially with the capture of John Brown at Harper's Ferry. He was slated to be the commander of Union forces, but after the secession of Virginia, his home state, he decided that he needed to fight with his state over country. And in fact, if you look at the picture on the right, this is a view of Lee's house from the backside of the Lincoln Memorial. Lee's house in Arlington was just on the opposite side of the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Lee never actually owned the mansion. It was actually owned by his wife, Mary Anna Custis Lee, who was the direct descendant of Martha Custis, George Washington's wife. She was George Washington's great-granddaughter. As the war raged on, the mansion would become a national cemetery used to bury officers, and also as a personal slight to Lee, making sure that he would never ever be able to return there after the war. Now, Lee was known for his aggressive style, and one thing that he wanted to do was invade the North to take control over Maryland, bringing Maryland into the Confederacy, isolating Washington, D.C., and forcing a surrender of Union forces. This led to the battle at Antietam Creek or Sharpsburg, Maryland. In this case, while Lee was generally tactically better than McClellan, McClellan had a huge advantage in the fact that he found Lee's battle plans wrapped around 3 cigars in one of Lee's former camps. After the orders were authenticated, the Union had the advantage to know exactly what Lee was up to and where Lee was going. However, General George McClellan delayed pursuit of Lee for a full 3 days. This allowed Thomas Stonewall Jackson to take Harper's Ferry along with 12,000 Union soldiers prisoner, along with 120,000 or so guns. It also allowed Lee to set up defensive fortifications and pick the site for the battle in where they would engage the Union forces. Antietam is known as the single bloodiest day in the Civil War. The battle focused on several choke points that allowed casualties to skyrocket, including Burnside's Bridge over Antietam Creek, as seen on the right, and the Bloody Lane, which was a sunken wagon track oftentimes used by local farmers. Confederate forces were able to set up their defensive fortifications beyond these 2 points, which forced Union forces to essentially funnel through them, allowing Confederates to pick them off one by one. The Union would lose 12,400 men, where the Confederacy would only lose 10,400. The fight was a stalemate. Lincoln was furious with George McClellan as his inability to deliver a decisive victory, even knowing what Lee was going to be up to. Although McClellan had double the numbers that Lee had, he held back half of his forces, thus evening out the numbers for Lee. The battle was considered a tactical draw. However, in the North, it would be played up as a victory, and Lincoln would use the excitement of this huge victory to deliver another blow to the Southern forces by delivering something that we will call the Emancipation Proclamation. He also used this occasion to fire McClellan as the lead in the Union Army. Now, the major fallout of Antietam is that it marked the first time that the Southern forces would make an incursion into the North. And even though they were not successful in getting Maryland to secede, they did show that they could invade northern states if they needed to. General George McClellan squandered a huge chance to destroy Lee's army and thus destroy the Confederate uprising. And however, the draw gave the North hope that they found the right man. If they found the right man, they could eventually destroy the much more aggressive Lee. Lincoln uses this issue to force the Emancipation Proclamation, and McClellan would be replaced by General Ambrose Burnside, known more for his sideburns than his ability to fight. Please summarize your notes and note why Ulysses S. Grant was successful in the Western Campaign compared with McClellan at Antietam. Thank you, and be ready to use this information tomorrow.